At the end of the 14th century, Paris was buzzing not with war or plague, but with a book. The Romance of the Rose, written by 2 generations of poets, was sold in markets, read aloud at dinners, and discussed as if it were a law. Some called it a textbook on love, others called it heresy against female honor. People argued in the squares, where does art end and insult begin? Friends, welcome. This is the story of a woman who did not accept the language of her time. And you are on a channel where we talk about people who change the rules. Right where you are watching from: France, Ukraine, Germany, Italy. It will be interesting to know. Make yourself comfortable and enjoy listening. When Christine de Pizan opened the book, she knew that it was not just an allegory. The Romance of the Rose is 200,000 verses about seduction, where a woman is portrayed as an object of desire and a test of morality. The author, Jean de Meun, who continued the story after the death of Guillaume de Lorry, turned the poetry of courtly love into a mockery. His heroine is not a beloved, but a pink trophy to which the hero must break through the walls of shame and prudence. For readers, it was witty. For Christine, it was disturbing. She grew up at the court of Charles V, among translators and philosophers. After her husband's death, Christine earned her living by writing, which was already a challenge. A woman writer at the end of the 14th century was almost unheard of, but she was the first to dare to say publicly that words can hurt as much as a sword. In her letters to Chancellor Jean de Montreuil and poet Gontier-Cole, she used phrases that would later be called the first feminist ones. She asked not about morality, but about the consequences. What would happen if a generation of men learned from poetry that a woman is a reward for persistence? Her opponents responded ironically and harshly. They claimed that the book merely reflected the natural order of things. One of the court poets called Christine a teacher of shame. This phrase expressed contempt for a woman who was trying to regulate the speech of men. But behind the words lay economics. At the end of the century, Paris was alive with copyists. Book workshops fed dozens of families, and popular texts brought in profits. By condemning the Romance of the Rose, Christine was attacking the market. Archival records show that in 1401, the word disputatio de rosa, a dispute about rose, appeared in the correspondence of the University of Paris. For the first time, a literary dispute became a public affair. Priests, poets, lawyers, everyone took sides. Some spoke of freedom of speech, others of the limits of decency. But few noticed that behind the dispute over poetry lay a fear of a woman who had taken on the role of critic. In one of her letters, Christina gives examples from court life: maids who were ridiculed for their education, widows who were called traps. She explains that language shapes attitudes. If women are a source of temptation in books, then they are to blame for the sins of men in real life. These arguments sounded like a challenge to centuries of preaching. And for the first time, their author was not a nun, but a secular writer. The debate went beyond letters. Copies of the letters were copied by students and read on the streets. This was the first time a woman had a public voice in a debate about morality. Surprisingly, even her enemies acknowledged that she wrote better. In simple words, without metaphors, like a lawyer or chronicler. Meanwhile, the Romance of the Rose continued to sell. Artists illustrated it, adding increasingly explicit miniatures. The church did not ban the book. Too many people at court quoted it. The irony was that a satire on love had become a textbook on behavior. Young knights actually memorized scenes of seduction as if they were instructions. What began as a poetic experiment became part of their education. Christine saw the danger in this. Her letters show that she understood the nature of influence. A word repeated hundreds of times becomes the norm. She wrote that mocking women was becoming a habit of society, and habit becomes law. These lines were later quoted in universities, but at the time they sounded like insolence. In early 1402, court philosophers joined the debate. Among them was Jean Gerson, the future chancellor of the Sorbonne. He supported Christine, calling the book morally harmful. Thus, the dispute moved from the realm of literature to politics. The royal court, where Queen Isabella of Bavaria held power after the madness of Charles VI, saw the dispute as an opportunity to present itself as a defender of morality. But behind the arguments about honor and poetry lay a struggle for an audience. Every writer depended on patrons. Christina wrote not only pamphlets, but also biographies and treatises addressed to noble ladies. Her texts were bought, read, and quoted. A woman who made her living with her pen became an example of a new profession, an intellectual without rank or title. It was this that frightened the men of her time more than her ideas. The controversy over the Romance of the Rose lasted for years, but it went down in history as a turning point. For the first time, a woman publicly challenged a text not from a moral standpoint, but from a rational one. And for the first time, she was heard not only by monks, but also by publishers. Because behind her words stood the market, and behind the market stood power over consciousness. When Parisian copyists noticed that Christine's letters were being copied more often than new poems by courtly poets, they encountered a new phenomenon for the first time: a woman dictating the agenda. Until then, the manuscript market had been a male domain. Copyists, miniaturists, editors, all were subject to university control. And suddenly, customers began to demand a copy of Madame de Pizan's polemic. She became a brand, even though the word did not exist at the time. Archival records from workshops indicate a growth in demand. 3 scrolls with letters from Lady Christina, copied cleanly, without distortion. This meant that the texts were not circulating as private correspondence, but as publications. In fact, we are witnessing the first media wave. The debate over the Romance of the Rose ceased to be a dispute among writers. It became a mirror of society. Jean de Meun's supporters responded with a series of epigrams. They contained words that would later be used against every woman who spoke out in the public sphere. Puritan, envious, does not understand art. They accused her of ignorance and at the same time feared her logic. Christine did not preach chastity, she demanded responsibility. But in a culture where the word love belonged to men, it sounded like heresy. Meanwhile, the debate intensified in university circles. Sorbonne students organized readings of excerpts from the Romance of the Rose and Christine's letters, presenting the audience with a choice. Some teachers forbade any mention of the woman in discussions, fearing ridicule from their colleagues. Others, on the contrary, used her arguments as an example of moral prudence. Thus, for the first time, a woman's voice was heard within the walls of the university, albeit through the mouths of men. A letter from Jean Gerson to his colleagues has been preserved, in which he describes the audience's reaction. They listened with surprise, as if a woman had proven for the first time that she was not incapable of reason. For its time, this sounded almost like a revelation. Humanism had not yet been born, but its seeds were already present in these debates. Queen Isabella's court was seething with its own passions. After the madness of Charles VI, power was divided between factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. Culture served as propaganda. Each camp sponsored its own poets. For some, Christina was a convenient figure, an example of pure morality. For others, she was an annoying moralist. She became a symbol without her consent. But Christina's letters were not sermons. They were investigations. She cited facts, cases of trials against women accused of seduction, even when it was a matter of rape. She quoted preachers' texts and compared words with deeds. Her style was dry, almost bureaucratic. Later, historians would say that she wrote like a notary of conscience. One of her treatises states, "If a word can destroy honor, then it bears responsibility." For men, this was a dangerous statement. After all, then any pamphlet, any song, any satirical poem could be considered a weapon of harm. Thus, the idea that literature does not exist outside of ethics entered the consciousness of the era. By the end of 1402, the dispute had reached the court chronicles. The king's scribes wrote brief summaries. Lady Christina claims that the book On the Rose is a lie against women. These records would later be found by archivists and called Europe's first public feminist act. But at that time, the word feminism did not exist. There was the concept of a reasonable woman, and it sounded almost like an accusation. There was a rumor among the copyists that Christina did not write herself, but with the help of monks, because a woman could not know Latin. This rumor was debunked by the university itself. Preserved manuscripts show that her Latin quotations are accurate, and her references to Aristotle and Boethius are error-free. She really did know philosophy, because she grew up in the home of a court astrologer. And that made her even more dangerous. She didn't just feel, she argued. Interestingly, the lists of buyers of her treatises include not only women, but also men. Among them are officials, notaries, and lawyers. They probably saw her texts not as a threat, but as an example of rational discourse. For them, Christina was a rarity, an author capable of discussing society without allegories. Meanwhile, in copies of the Romance of the Rose, copyists began to make notes in the margins. Offensive, against honor. Thus, the discussion entered the text itself. The book, which was considered complete, began to change. Individual phrases were crossed out, episodes were softened. In later editions of the late 15th century, some of the most liberal scenes are already missing. Christine's criticism changed literature itself, although no one acknowledged this directly. And yet her victory was incomplete. After several years of controversy, she withdrew from the debate and turned to other works, biographies, chronicles, The City of Ladies. Her silence was called a defeat, but the documents tell a different story. When subsequent writers referred to Christina, they used her arguments about dignity and responsibility. She did not leave as a loser, but as someone who had established the rules of the game. By the time the royal advisors in Paris changed, the dispute over the rose had become part of cultural memory. It was not retold in detail, but it left its mark on how texts were read and how women were thought of. After Christina, it was no longer possible to write about love without a shadow of doubt. Wouldn't it hurt those who were written about? After years of heated debate, Christine disappeared from public chronicles for almost a decade. But traces of her influence did not disappear. As is often the case, ideas live longer than their controversies. Parisian copyists continued to include her letters in collections, alongside chronicles and sermons. For 15th century readers, she became an authority, strict but fair. In the eyes of copyists, this meant commercial gain. Christine's name guaranteed the attention of noblewomen and educated burghers. For the first time in history, a woman became a sales guarantee. Meanwhile, universities continued to reproduce the male model of education. Humanism was just emerging, and almost the entire body of classical knowledge was interpreted by men. Against this backdrop, Christina's figure served as a reminder. The mind and the pen have no gender. Her early texts were copied by students of convent schools, where literacy was considered piety rather than pride. Some of them added in the margins, "This lady has shown that a woman can think without shame." These lines have been preserved, and in them lies the emotional power of an era where every manuscript was an act of resistance. By this time, Christina was working on her magnum opus, The City of Ladies. It was not a utopia, but a kind of encyclopedia of dignified female life. In it, she collected examples from history, queens, poets, saints, and proved that female virtue is not an exception, but the rule. Historians would later call this text the first systematic attempt to rewrite the genealogy of culture. But at the beginning of the 15th century, the book seemed dangerous. It lacked men. She made no secret of the fact that the idea for the city grew out of the pain of the previous dispute. The Romance of the Rose showed how words can humiliate, while the City of Ladies showed how words can protect. This logic made Christine one of the first to view text as a social tool. Her pen became an extension of the court. Each woman's story became an argument against slander, each example proof of the invisible statistics of injustice. However, her new fame sparked a new wave of ridicule. Clergymen and poets said that the lady from Pizan had decided to build a city without men. Pamphlets again compared her to a hermit nun. Some even claimed that she secretly led a community of learned ladies, although in reality they were just copyists and patrons who helped her distribute her texts. But in the eyes of society, any female solidarity already seemed like a cult. Behind this ridicule lay fear and envy. Paris was experiencing cultural stagnation. Courts were becoming poorer, patrons were disappearing, and wars were emptying the treasury. Male writers depended on the mercy of aristocrats, while Christine managed to build a network of patrons, duchesses, abbesses, and widows who were philanthropists. Women's economic independence was turning into a social revolution. She proved that it was possible to write not out of fear, but for pay, and still remain true to one's convictions. When a new wave of war with England began in 1415, Christine took up her pen again, this time not for debate, but for chronicle. Her Song of Joan of Arc, written years later, would become the first document in which a woman praises another woman as a political hero. This text is late, but its roots lie in the old dispute about the rose. There, Christina learned to see words as weapons. Meanwhile, the university continued to remember the dispute as a curiosity. Students retold it in anecdotes, not realizing that it was from this conflict that future debates about the morality of literature arose. By the middle of the 15th century, treatises on the benefits and harms of reading had appeared in France. They formulated the idea for the first time. The author is responsible for the reader's feelings. This is a direct legacy of Christine. The term responsible literature did not yet exist at that time, but the first precedents appeared in court cases. Several poets were brought before church investigations for offensive images. No one referred to the female writer, but the grounds were the same. Thus, her ideas entered the law through practice. Christine ended her life in the Poissy convent, where the widows of the court spent their final years. Chronicles report that she died after 1430, probably shortly after the news of Joan of Arc's rehabilitation. Her grave has not survived, but her manuscripts have endured for centuries. In the margins of later copies of the City of Ladies, copyists wrote, "This work was written by a woman in praise of reason." These words quietly sum up her struggle. The dispute over the Romance of the Rose was not a defeat for her, but a lesson in reality. She understood that the language of society is its most powerful tool, and that it can only be changed through perseverance. This perseverance was not rebellion, but method. Where others prayed, Christine wrote. And so she went down in history, not as a victim of her era, but as its corrector. Only one generation passed after Christina's death, and Paris was once again alive with books. Only now, books were printed not by hand, but by machines. The first printing house opened near the Quai Saint-Jacques, and the craftsmen, having sorted through old manuscripts, chose proven texts for publication. Among them was the Romance of the Rose. It seemed that the circle had come full circle. The very poem that had sparked the controversy was back on the table, but now as part of the cultural canon. However, along with it, The publishers also printed collections of letters by Christine de Pizan. In the prefaces, they called her a learned lady who stood up to free authors. There was no mockery or condemnation in these lines, only respect. Paradoxically, it was the printing press, the tool of a new era, that did what universities could not. It recognized women as part of intellectual history. Some catalogs even noted that her letters improved the reader's character. For publishers, this was pragmatic. The image of a rational woman attracted buyers from among wealthy widows, abbesses, and teachers. Christina, even posthumously, continued to generate income. And in doing so, she established a new norm. A woman's word can be a commodity, but not something that sells someone else's honor. In those years, Europe was undergoing a cultural upheaval. Italian humanists wrote about sublime love. French poets copied their styles, but Christina's restraint now seemed not hypocritical, but tasteful. Her influence can even be felt in the codes of conduct at court. One 15th century court manual states, "A lady's speech should be clear, not cunning, and her words should not serve as bait." The wording strangely echoes Christina's ideas, even though the author is a man. Historians would later call this effect unspoken review. Books that appeared after the controversy over La Rose seem to have become more cautious themselves. Authors began to think about how their words would be read by women. It was not equality, but it was a step toward respect. For the first time, literature felt boundaries set not by censorship, but by conscience. Meanwhile, the concept of the love manual, so popular in the 14th century, disappeared from cultural circulation. Courtly love became outdated, giving way to realistic genres. And when 15th century critics tried to explain why old poems seemed vulgar, they spoke of a decline in taste. But the reason was different. Society had learned to see humiliation where it had previously seen playfulness. Christine unwittingly changed the very nature of reading. Before her, text was considered a mirror, a reflection of the world. After her, it became a mirror of responsibility. People began to ask not only what is written, but also why. Universities introduced the discipline of writing ethics, where words were analyzed in terms of their impact on the mind and soul. Preserved lecture notes from the 15th century mention female criticism of allegory, which was, in essence, a recognition of de Pizan's achievements. It is curious that the controversy itself gave rise to a new generation of women writers. In Flanders and Burgundy, female translators appeared, rewriting treatises with notes such as, "According to Mrs. Christine." Their works have barely survived, but the very fact that such notes exist indicates that her voice did not fade away. Writing ceased to be an exclusively male occupation. But with recognition came compromise. Printers often softened her wording, removing the sharpest accusations against male poets. In some editions, the word insult was replaced with indecency. It was an attempt to make her thoughts safe. Even after her death, attempts were made to edit Christina, as with any woman who had said too much. Nevertheless, the very presence of her name in printed catalogs became a fact of political significance. By the end of the 15th century, when female patrons began to collect their own libraries, Christina found herself among Boethius, Seneca, and the Bible. In the margins of inventory lists, there are short comments. A book about the honor of ladies. Thus, her ideas became part of moral education, unofficial but enduring. The public space, once a hotbed of debate, had changed. Paris became a city of printing presses rather than debaters. People no longer took to the streets to discuss poetry. But in quiet rooms, where printing presses creaked, a new reality was being created. Books were now written with readers of both sexes in mind. Even satires became less straightforward, as if every author felt the gaze of a woman over his shoulder. Thus, A dispute that began as personal indignation ended in cultural transformation. No one issued a decree, no one rewrote the law, but the very discourse of society changed. The allegory of rose faded away, and in its place grew texts where love ceased to be a game of power. When 16th century historians reviewed the chronicles of the previous century, they wrote about a softening of morals. And although Christina's name was rarely mentioned, her echo could be heard in every treatise on decent speech. Words became cautious, not because they feared judgment, but because they had learned pain. When the era of the printed word finally replaced handwritten scrolls, Christina's mark had already been inscribed in the fabric of culture. But her figure dissolved, not into oblivion, but into habit. Her ideas became so natural that they no longer seemed foreign. Any woman who held a pen in the 16th century wrote in her shadow without even knowing it. Historians of humanism long ignored her. There were no mothers in the lists of the fathers of the Renaissance. French culture preferred to remember lovers rather than critics of love. It was only in the 19th century that archivists, sorting through old scrolls from the Poissy monastery, found her handwritten notes, pages copied in neat Gothic script with a polemic against the romance of the rose. A note was preserved in the margins: "Let words not be a weapon against those who cannot respond." This phrase became the key to understanding her entire work. What her contemporaries called morality was in fact a foreshadowing of humanism. Christine did not demand censorship, she demanded conscience. For the end of the 14th century, this was almost sedition. In a world where power came from God and the king, demanding responsibility from an author meant putting reason on a par with power. She did not deny sensuality and love. She saw them as a responsibility, because behind them stood destinies, not symbols. Christine was the first to show that literature is not only art, but also behavior. She did not ask for books to be burned, as fanatics did. She demanded that books be held accountable for their consequences. Her letters were the first instance of a woman raising the question of the right to interpretation. Before her, the meaning of a text was determined by men. After her, it was determined by the public. Chronologists note a coincidence. Half a century after her death, French humanists introduced the term décence, decency, in the sense of moderation of speech. In the treatises of Rabelais and Montaigne, this idea would become the principle of freedom, balanced by honesty. They never mentioned Christine, but the structure of their thinking was a direct continuation of her dispute. For her contemporaries, her life was too quiet to be called revolutionary. But from a historical distance, it is clear that she was the one who moved the debate on morality from the church pulpit to the secular sphere. And for the first time, she questioned the monopoly of the male view of love, art, and honor. She did what orders, universities, and kings could not. She changed the attitude toward the word. The myth of the dark Middle Ages, where women were silent, is shattered by her handwriting. This myth is convenient because it justifies the progress of subsequent centuries. But the documents tell a different story. The Paris archives hold invoices for her manuscripts, letters with university seals, and sales receipts. Every line bears the mark of visible work, women's work, paid for and recognized. The Middle Ages were not silent. It's just that not everyone was listened to. And yet, the price of this voice was high. After Christine's death, no woman in France received such publicity for almost 200 years. Her example became not a price to pay, but a warning. Any word spoken aloud turns the author into a target. Only in the 17th century, with Madame de Scuderi's Salon, would her tone return, calm, rational, without anger, but with inner dignity. Today, her name is mentioned in university courses as the first European writer to realize the political power of language. This is a dry formula, but behind it lies the life of a widow, copying manuscripts by candlelight, surrounded by boy copyists who secretly read her texts. They laugh, not realizing that they are looking at the future. If you listen to the chronicles, you can hear the quiet movement of the pen above the noise of centuries. Not a sword, not a bonfire, not a crowd, but a pen scratching on paper. It does what power cannot. It corrects the world without bloodshed. This is the true meaning of her struggle, to show that correction is possible even where no one asks for forgiveness. Myth versus document. They say the Middle Ages were misogynistic, but documents tell of a woman who responded with words and went down in history precisely because she chose text over silence. And when European museums today exhibit miniatures from the Romance of the Rose, they increasingly place alongside them a portrait of Christine de Pizan, in a blue dress with an open codex on her lap. There is no anger on her face, only fatigue and attention. She is not looking at us, but through us, to where the word is still searching for conscience.